By the time we get to the vascular seedless plants, vascular and seedless, oops. By the time we get to the vascular seedless plants, we've actually seen really a lot of change in what plants can do. To get from the non-vascular plants to the vascular seedless plants, there were two big adjustments. The first, and by far the biggest, is that they developed vascular tissue. Vascular tissue, well, when you think of it, it like means arteries and veins. Well, they don't have blood, but they do have fluid that flows through them, and it flows through them in tubes that are analogous to our arteries and veins, okay? And because they now have got vascular tissue, they can build roots that reach down into the soil to get water, and then they can get themselves to be really big and tall, and they know the water can be transported up to them through these tubes. It allowed them to get really, really big. The other adjustment that the vascular seedless plants made was they made it so that the plant that you see from here on out is diploid. So remember, the only place that's got a dominant gametophyte generation, which means the plant that you're looking at is haploid, that's just the first groups, the non-vascular plants. From here on out, the plant you see is always going to be diploid. And it's always going to be the sporophyte generation because it's the sporophyte that is diploid, and it's everything else that's haploid. Now, this vascular tissue is divided up into xylem and phloem. They are different tubes. There are different tubes in every plant that is vascular. The xylem is transporting water from the roots up to the fronds or up to the leaves. The phloem transport glucose that's been made by photosynthesis in the leaves or the fronds, and the phloem is transporting that nutrition around the plant. So two different sets of tubes. The way I remember them is I remember that the phloem transports food, and of course food from the point of view of a plant is going to be the glucose that's made by photosynthesis. And that leaves the xylem to transport the water, right? Now, ferns, you probably know what a fern looks like. Equisetum, you may not know what equisetum look like, but you've seen them, okay? So we'll look at both of them. The vascular seedless plants, their big invention was a circulatory system, vascular tubes that are carrying nutrition from one part of the plant to another, water from the roots up to the leaf-like things. Now, this thing that you're looking at, that is the plant that you're looking at, it does not make gametes. This is still the sporophyte generation. It is diploid. And the sporophyte generation makes what? Yes, spores. It makes spores. And I will show you where those spores are made, because you need to know that, not just for next week's quiz, but also for the lab final. Okay? Now, those spores are more resistant to drying out than the spores that are made by mosses. So these spores can actually be dispersed through the wind. And then they still need to land in very wet areas if they're going to turn into a gametophyte and be able to make gametes. But the spores themselves are more resistant to drying out. And so these guys already can spread themselves farther, more quickly than mosses can. They still have got the alternation of generations. So there are a lot more ferns than there are equisetum or horsetails. Some of the horsetails, I've got pictures of them. Okay, so this is what ferns look like. And here, these are the most common horsetails, equisetum, here in Southern California. Some people call them snake plants. I don't know if your family had them in your garden, but they kind of pop apart at these little joints. Those are the equisetum. All right. So here we are. Now we are looking at the life cycle of a fern. Ferns are diploid, so they are 2N. So this guy right here, he is the sporophyte generation. He will make spores. Now, ferns are very organized about the way they make spores. They will make spores in a structure called a sporangium, and many, many sporangia will accumulate in little areas on the underside of fern fronds in areas called a sorus, or the plural is sori. I have a picture of that? Okay, here. Okay, so here is a fern frond, and then we're looking at the underside of the fern frond, and you see those circle-like things that look tan? Each circle is called a sorus. And so this fern has got many, many sori. Sori, I don't know which way you want to pronounce it. And if I were to take a microscope and look in detail at the sori, I would find that in there are lots of sporangia. And the sporangia are the little structures that make spores. So the spores get made by the sporangia. The sporangia are grouped into the sori, and the sori are found on the other side of a fern frond. Ta-da! Okay. So the fern is a sporophyte, so you know it's going to make spores. It's a little fancier in how it makes its spores. It makes them in sporangia, and those sporangia are grouped together in those round structures on the undersides of the fronds called sori. When those spores blow around and they land somewhere, they'll grow up into a little tiny heart-shaped plant-like thing called that is a gametophyte. It's also known as a prothallus, but that's not a term that I will use on my quizzes. Okay? The gametophyte generation of the sperm very often is about the size of your thumbnail, and it's about as thick as your fingernail. They're very much like the original liverworts and hornworts. They are haploid, right? The gametophyte generation is always haploid, and it is going to make eggs and sperm, and the sperm swim just like they did with the moss, and they will swim over to find an egg, and then they will make a little tiny embryo. So this thing here, let me outline it. That was the gametophyte generation. That was this thing right here is now that thing that we see laying down from the side. And where the egg and the sperm came together, we will start growing a sporophyte, and the young fern will grow right out of the gametophyte generation, and it'll disappear, and then you will just see a fern. Now, ferns do have rhizomes, but they actually also have true roots. And ferns can get very big. During the time of the dinosaurs, the largest trees around often were giant ferns. So ferns can get rather large. Also in the time of the dinosaurs, they had conifers, like not pine trees, but in that same group, but they didn't have flowers yet. So there you go. Okay. So here we have got a whole bunch of ferns. These are very young ferns. So somewhere down in there was that prothallus, that gametophyte generation, and now the fern is growing up out of it. And here we can see the sori. Sori are filled with sporangia. Sporangia are busy making ferns. Important. These guys can grow in a drier environment than mosses, liverworts, and hornworts can. Drier, but not completely dry environments the way other plants can, because they still need a droplet of water for the growth of their gametophyte generation, and so that the sperm that are made can swim over to the eggs that are made. So they are still dependent on free water in a way that the next sets of plants that we'll study next week are not. And that is what our equisetum around here look like. Oh, this is a beautiful picture. Do you see how nearly transparent that is? That is the haploid, the 1N gametophyte generation, and it at some point made eggs and the sperm swam to the eggs in a droplet of water, and now this is the beginning of our sporophyte generation, 2N sporophyte, and it will grow up to become a fern. So the ferns you buy in the grocery store or wherever you buy your ferns, that is a diploid organism. The sori are found on the underside of the fern. Here, these sori are much smaller. It is a cluster of sporangia, and sporangia, you could see them through the microscope. They produce haploid spores that will make the gametophyte generation. Okay, do I have a picture? Oh man, I wanted to show you a picture of what a... Do yourselves a favor and look up what a sporangium looks like through the microscope. Yep, I'll look it up for you. Sporangium, because I might show you one and ask you what it is or where you find it. So sporangium, and we'll do images. Okay, yeah, we look at these usually through the microscope. Okay, this is what they look like, generally speaking. So you can see that, no, should have known it was going to do that. Ooh, that's neat. Okay, so these guys, those are sori. Here we're looking at individual sporangia. See, that's a sporangia? Those are very, very big, little sporangia, and they're busy making spores. So this is a drawing of a sporangium, and when they dry out, they pop, boom, release spores. And here's a picture of spores. Oh, isn't that lovely? All right, good. So make sure you know what they look like. I think they kind of look, I don't know, they kind of look like little dragon-like things. Okay, so that's it. Next week, we are going to talk about how plants went from being these non-vascular things that had to stay really small, low to the ground because they didn't have a vascular system, and they have the dominant gametophyte generation. And then we get this big advancement. We get the development of a vascular system that changed everything. And now the dominant generation from here on in is sporophyte and is diploid. But we still have these separate gametophyte organisms that are very much like the ancient liverworts and hornworts. And the new generation of sporophyte will grow right out of there. And then next week, we're going to talk about the evolution of seeds, and then the evolution of flowers, but that'll be next week.